Welcome everyone to the Mysteries Abound podcast. This is your host Paul, and this is episode 99. Episode 99 is entitled, Is This the World's Oldest Secret Code? But first up this week, a story from the Scotsman.com website, and it's written by Martin McLaughlin. A London museum planned to shoot and steal Nessie. At a time when sightings of the nation's most elusive inhabitant were treated with gravity by British officialdom, it was a fiendish plan to snatch her from under Scottish noses. Newly discovered documents have revealed how the National History Museum in London appealed to so-called bounty hunters to help secure the carcass of the Loch Ness monster, according to a new book. It claims the files, dating back to the 1930s, show staff at the institution were keen to steal a march on museums in Scotland and around the world by exhibiting all, or part, of the beast's remains. Although Nessie now occupies a prized place in Scottish mythology alongside Flying Haggis and Brigadoon, the correspondence from the museum's archives demonstrate the seriousness with which early rumours of her existence were treated. In 1934, a year after the first sightings of a supposedly mysterious creature lurking in the loch's depths, the book claims a National History Museum employee made clear it would be keen to trump institutions such as Edinburgh's Royal Scottish Museum. In a letter dated March of that year, the unnamed official responded to questions about the museum's policy on Nessie. The message was black and white. Should you ever come within range of the monster, I hope you will not be deterred by humanitarian considerations from shooting him on the spot and sending the carcass to us in cold storage, carriage forward, the letter stated, before adding, short of this, a flipper, a jaw or a tooth would be very welcome. The remarkable advice is detailed in Britain's Extraordinary Files, a book examining various myths and stories in the country's folklore. Author David Clarke said while researchers already knew about similar files at the Royal Scottish Museum, the discovery of similar documents at the National History Museum left him astonished. He said many influential people, including MPs and famous naturalists like Sir Peter Scott, believed in the existence of Nessie, and a lot of pressure was placed on the Scottish Office to give it special protection. During the 1930s, the monster became an important symbol for Scottish nationalists who wanted the police to protect the creature from big game hunters. Nessie had become a Scottish icon, a symbol of national identity. He added, there was genuine outrage at the possibility that the corpse of the monster might be taken for display in London. While the National History Museum was working behind the scenes to secure the creature, the Royal Scottish Museum warned against the prospect of Nessie being put on display south of the border. In a 1934 letter to the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Sir Godfrey Collins, the museum staked Edinburgh's claim to the carcass. It stated, the museum urges strongly that the Royal Scottish Museum have the reversionary rights to the monster if and when its corpse should become available. We think the monster should not be allowed to find its last resting place in England. Such a fate would surely outrage Scottish nationalism, which at the moment is thriving greatly under the monster's beneficent influence. The Scotland Office opened a file on the monster in December 1933 in Edinburgh after being bombarded with inquiries from the press. According to more files found in Edinburgh, pressure was already growing for a special Act of Parliament to prevent Nessie being killed or captured. The campaign was led by Inverness MP Murdoch MacDonald, who assured Sir Godfrey the creature was no myth. Evidence of its presence can be taken as undoubted. Far too many people have seen something abnormal to question its existence, he wrote. He demanded a bill be put before Parliament to protect the creature and asked Sir Godfrey what could be done to spare it from harm in the meantime. Sir Godfrey was advised that there was no law for the protection of monsters, and great fish, including those of no known denomination, may be claimed by the Crown. In later decades, the National History Museum's appetite for all matters Nessie waned considerably. The archives show that in October 1959, it wrote to employees, warning them the trustees do not approve of the spending of official time or official leave on the so-called Loch Ness phenomena. Was King Harold really killed by an arrow in the eye? Archaeologists are to examine a theory that he survived the Battle of Hastings and died as an 80-year-old hermit. And this comes from the dailymail.co.uk website, and it's written by Jennifer Smith. Shot through the eye by an arrow, he died at the hands of 4 Norman knights, brutally dismembering his body, or so almost 950 years of history dictates. But archaeologists are now claiming King Harold may have survived the Battle of Hastings and lived out his years before quietly dying of old age. The alternative version of events put forward in a 12th century document housed in the British Museum discounts the Norman's portrayal of his death in the Bayeux Tapestry. The artwork, long considered an accurate description of the 1066 Battle of Hastings, shows King Harold clutching at an arrow in his eye as 4 Norman knights hack at his body. But now a team of historians who discovered the remains of Richard III in a municipal car park in Leicester in 2012 are eager to dispel the long-accepted theory. Oval Film and Stratascan, whose efforts were applauded around the world for the discovery, will carry out an underground scan of Abbey Gardens in Waltham Abbey Church in Essex, the supposed site of King Harold's tomb, to look for his remains. We have the Norman story put through the Bayeux Tapestry. The English story is a different one, said Peter Burke, a historian at Waltham Abbey. You put things together and it begins to build a picture that is quite solid. If everything backs you up in history, you should look at it. You shouldn't just leave it, the 64-year-old told the Independent newspaper. I am convinced Harold survived the Battle of Hastings. If we find the complete remains of an old man in his late 70s with scarring to his temple from a battle wound, then we need to do a DNA test. Our understanding of this particular period of English history would have to change. Fronting £2,000 for the project, Mr. Burke will oversee a scan of the church's grounds on Tuesday, roughly 15 yards from his alleged tomb at the High Altar. If anything is picked up by the scan, English Heritage will have to apply to the Secretary of State for permission to excavate the site. However, members of the Waltham Abbey Historical Society think it is unlikely they will find anything of interest, as the site has been disturbed by building works over the years. The remains of Richard III were found in a car park in Leicester in 2012. It was the site of the lost Greyfriars Church, where the royal had been buried following his death in the Battle of Bosworth Field. And while we're hanging around in Great Britain, from the birminghammail.co.uk website, a story by Mike Lockley. Black-eyed child returns to haunt Cannock Chase. A leading paranormal investigator has scoured a Staffordshire beauty spot following chilling sightings of a spectre known locally as the Black-eyed Child. Lee Brickley launched an in-depth investigation of Cannock Chase after reports that the ghoulish apparition had returned to the sprawling heathland. The child was last spotted 30 years ago, sparking worldwide interest, and is today a cult internet sensation. Latest descriptions of the girl, who has coal black pits for eye sockets, are identical to those chronicled in the early 1980s. Lee, author of books about the paranormal, was stunned recently when he received a new eyewitness account of the black-eyed child. Alerted by what sounded like screams, a shocked woman came across the wandering, sightless spectre while walking Birches Valley. We instantly started running towards the noise, she said. We couldn't find the child anywhere, and so stopped to catch our breath. That's when I turned round and saw a girl standing behind me, no more than 10 years old, with her hands over her eyes. It was as if she was waiting for a birthday cake. I asked if she was okay, and if she had been the one screaming. She put her arms down by her side and opened her eyes. That's when I saw they were completely black. No iris, no white, nothing. I jumped back and grabbed my daughter. When I looked again, the child was gone. It was so strange. Lee, 28, and himself from Cannock, said the woman's experience mirrors the earlier sightings. In the summer of 1982, my aunt was 18 years old, and she and her friends would often meet on Cannock Chase in the evening time, probably in much the same way many teenagers still do today. One evening, just before dark, she heard a little girl frantically shouting for help. Rushing to locate the sound, she stumbled upon a dirt track and caught sight of the girl, about 6 years old, running in the opposite direction. When my aunt caught up, the girl turned around and looked in her eyes and then ran off into the dark woodland. Her eyes had been completely black, with no trace of white. There was a police search, but to no avail. At the time, no one had any reason to believe anything paranormal was going on. The girl certainly appeared to be of flesh and blood. There have been similar sightings of black-eyed children around the world. Some people believe them to be extraterrestrials, vampires or ghosts, said Lee. But there is one big difference between the sightings around the world and the stories coming out of Cannock Chase. Only on Cannock Chase do the sightings consistently happen during the daytime. In the US, many reports suggest that black-eyed children often appear in groups, regularly knocking at the door of unknowing victims and asking quietly if they may come inside. From the mentalfloss.com website, an article by Matt Soniak. Why do witches ride brooms? The popular image of a witch, which you can see everywhere right now in the form of Halloween costumes and decorations, is a woman with a pointy hat and warty nose, stirring a cauldron or flying on a broom. How did that odd choice of transportation get tied to witches and locked into our collective imagination? One proposed explanation has its roots in a pagan ritual where people danced astride poles, pitchforks and brooms in their fields, jumping as high as they could to entice their crops to grow to that height. Anyone observing the leaping broomstick dance of witches at the full moon, says anthropologist Robin Skelton, could be expected to think of flying. Another explanation is that the broomsticks and the potions that witches brewed in their cauldrons are linked, and the former was a tool for delivering the latter. During the witch panics of the Middle Ages, authorities confiscated various brews, ointments and salves from people accused of witchcraft and sorcery. In the early 1500s, physician Andres Laguna described one such substance that was taken from the home of an accused witch as a pot full of a green ointment composed of sporific herbs such as hemlock, nightshade, henbane and mandrake. The local constable was a friend of Laguna's, so the doctor was able to obtain some of the ointment to experiment with. His first test subject was the executioner's wife, whom he anointed head to foot with the green stuff. No sooner did I anoint her than she opened her eyes wide like a rabbit, and soon they looked like those of a cooked hare when she fell into such a profound sleep that I thought I should never be able to wake her, Laguna wrote. However, after the lapse of 36 hours, I restored her to her senses and sanity. When the woman was conscious again, she asked Laguna, "Why did you awaken me? Badness to you at such an inauspicious moment. Why, I was surrounded by all the delights in the world." She then turned to her husband and claimed that she had cuckolded him and taken a younger and lustier lover. Laguna wrote that even long after her dream, the executioner's wife stuck to many of her crazy notions. From all this we may infer that all that those wretched witches do and say is caused by potions and ointments, which so corrupt their memory and imagination that they create their own woes. For they firmly believe when awake all that they had dreamed when asleep, he said. Another 16th century physician, Giovanni della Porta, described a similar case where he witnessed a suspected witch apply one of her ointments. She also fell into a most sound and heavy sleep, and when she awoke, began to speak many vain and doting words, affirming that she had passed over both sea and mountains. He reached a similar conclusion as Laguna. These potions were the source of the bizarre things that witches claimed to experience and partake in. After applying their ointments, Della Porta wrote, these women seemed to be carried in the air, to feasting, singing, dancing, kissing, culling, and other acts of venery, with such youths as they love and desire most. For the force of their imagination is so vehement that almost all that part of the brain, wherein the memory consists, is full of such concepts. In the centuries since, scientists have confirmed the two doctors' suspicions. There was no black magic at work in witches' brews, just chemistry, and the events of the Sabbat were an imaginative fiction, exasperated by malnutrition and by the use of hallucinogenic concoctions. Many of the botanical ingredients included in witches' potions, says pharmacologist David Kroll, including nightshade, henbane, mandrake and jimson weed, contain hallucinogenic chemicals called tropane alkaloids. These chemicals can cause vivid dreams and the sensation of flight, not unlike those reported by Della Porta's witch and others accused of witchcraft. In his own experiments with henbane, toxicologist Gustav Schenk reported feeling an intoxicating sensation of flying. I soared where my hallucinations, the clouds, the lowering sky, herds of beasts, falling leaves which were quite unlike any ordinary leaves, billowing streamers of steam and rivers of molten metal were swirling along. Clearly these chemicals are potent, but they can also be dangerous. Ingesting them by drinking a witch's brew could lead to side effects ranging from mere intestinal discomfort to death. Jimson weed poisoning, for example, sometimes left its victims hot as a hare, blind as a bat, dry as a bone, red as a beet, and mad as a wet hen. To get around the risks of taking these potions orally, somewhere, some clever witch figured out an alternate way for getting them inside the body. A staff, stick or a tool they already had around the house. The broom. The hallucinogens in the brews, it turns out, can be absorbed through the skin without any of the unpleasant side effects. Some of the best places for absorption are the sweat glands in the armpits and the mucous membranes around the rectum and female genitalia. To apply the potion to these places, witches would slather them on their brooms and ride them to their witchery gatherings. Antoine Rose, accused of witchcraft in France, confessed as much to the authorities. She claimed that the devil had given her a stick and a pot of ointment, and that to apply it she would smear the ointment on the stick, put it between her legs and say, "Go, in the name of the devil, go." Other confessions and investigations turned up the same technique. In the 1300s, authorities searching for the home of suspected witch Alice Keitler found a pipe of ointment, wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin. A century later, theologian Jordanus de Bergamo noted that the witches confessed that on certain days or nights they anoint a staff and ride on it to the appointed place, or anoint themselves under the arms and in other hairy places. In some cases, the accused specifically mentioned a broomstick as their tool of choice. In 1453, Guillaume Edelin, accused of witchcraft in France, admitted to flying on a broomstick, and later a man confessed to seeing his aged mother straddle a broomstick and whisk up the chimney and out of the house. So folks were using brooms covered with hallucinogenic concoctions to produce vivid dreams that involved travelling through the air and partaking in wild sex and other rites. Add some rumour and fear-mongering and twist it around a little bit, and it's easy to see how people got the idea that witches were literally flying on their broomsticks, aided by magic ointments to their black masses. To be fair, we have to take some of this with a grain of salt, given where the information is originally coming from. On the one hand, you have the church and government authorities and their citizen observers, who were often motivated by paranoia and social pressure to find and root witches out. As anthropologist Humayun Sidki notes, some historians dismiss the involvement of drugs in the practices of witches and argue that any witches' potions, magic or not, were made up by the authorities to paint the targets of their persecution as more sinister. On the other hand, you have the accused witches, who often gave their testimony and confessions under duress or torture. Still, it's an interesting idea, and makes you look at the typical witch costume in a different light. Halloween, or the ancient Samhain, is considered the time of the year when the veil between our world and the spirit world is at its thinnest. As darkness falls and families light their pumpkin jack-o'-lanterns, they are, perhaps unknowingly, repeating the ancient traditions of honouring the dead and marking the beginning of the dark half of the year. From the www.ancientorigins.net website, an article by Leslie Flaw. Crossing the Veil, the pre-Christian origins of Halloween and Samhain. Halloween is an annual celebration held largely in the Western world on October the 31st. Starting in the evening, children and sometimes adults dress in masks and costumes, traditionally as ghostly figures, witches or the undead. They go knocking door to door, requesting treats or else threatening a mischievous trick upon the household. Typical activities of the modern observance can include costume parties, pumpkin carving, trick-or-treating, lighting bonfires and playing pranks and more. Halloween, a shortened form of All Hallows Evening, is the echo of Celtic harvest festivals of pre-Christian Europe. Observed now in several countries around the world, it is the evening before All Hallows Day, when saints, All Hallows, and martyrs are remembered by people of many Christian denominations. This ritual, however, coincides with, and some scholars suggest co-opted, the ancient observance of Samhain. Samhain is the traditional Gaelic festival marking the change of seasons and the approach of winter. Wikipedia describes this pre-Christian custom. Many important events in Irish mythology happen or begin on Samhain. It's the time when cattle were brought back down from the summer pastures, and when livestock was slaughtered for winter. At Beltane, special bonfires were lit. These were deemed to have protective and cleansing powers, and there were rituals involving them. Samhain, like Beltane, was seen as a liminal time, when the spirits of the fairies, the Asossi, could more easily come into our world. Fires and later candles were lit to mimic the sun and hold back the dark of the oncoming winter. Dead and departed relatives played a central role in the tradition, as the connection between the living and dead was believed stronger at Samhain, and there was a chance to communicate. Souls of the deceased were thought to return to their homes. Feasts were held and places were set at tables as a way to welcome them home. Food and drink was offered to the unpredictable spirits and fairies to ensure continued health and good fortune. The idea that souls return home on a certain day of the year is repeated across many cultures around the world. Dia de Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, is a similar holiday in Mexico, celebrating and honouring family members who have died. Similarly, this falls on October 31st and November 1st and 2nd. Samhain saw a metamorphosis due to the early church. The history of Halloween or Samhain, Jack Santino writes, as a result of their efforts to wipe out pagan holidays, such as Samhain, the Christians succeeded in effecting major transformations in it. In 601 AD, Pope Gregory I issued a now famous edict to his missionaries concerning the native beliefs and customs of the peoples he hoped to convert. Rather than try to obliterate native peoples' customs and beliefs, the Pope instructed his missionaries to use them. If a group of people worshipped a tree, rather than cut it down, he advised them to consecrate it to Christ and allow its continued worship. In the 12th century, holy days of obligation across Europe involved town criers, dressed all in black, ringing mournful bells and calling on Christians to remember the poor souls of the dead. Special soul cakes were baked and shared. This custom of souling was shared in England, Germany, Belgium, Austria and Italy, and is thought to be the early precursor of trick-or-treating. Eventually, mumming and guising, going door to door in disguise and performing in exchange for food, was taken up in a depiction of these ancient customs. Pranks were a way of confounding evil spirits. Pranks at Samhain date back as far as 1736 in Scotland and Ireland, and this led to Samhain being dubbed Mischief Night. Many of the modern practices for Halloween date to 19th century England and North America. Fortune-telling and divination played a part in celebrations. Games were played intending to divine one's future. Nuts and fruit featured in the eating and drinking games, and soul cakes were prepared. For Halloween, pumpkins are hollowed out and spooky faces are carved into them, creating jack-o'-lanterns. Candles are then lit inside the pumpkins, creating eerie lanterns and serving as signals that a household observes Halloween. Pumpkins are frequently used today as they're easier to carve and a symbol of harvest, but the original lanterns in Ireland and Scotland were carved from turnips. These turnip lanterns were used to frighten off evil spirits by guisers and were a motif of the Irish Christian folktale of Jack, a wandering soul who was denied entry into both heaven and hell. Observing Halloween is not without controversy. Some religions discourage participation, suggesting that it trivialises Samhain. It has satanic associations, or it is an inappropriate tribute to paganism or the occult. However, the modern practices, heavily influenced by commercialisation and popular culture, differ appreciably from the ancient traditions of Samhain and All Hallows' Eve. Still, the connection exists and the history is clear. When you light a jack-o'-lantern and brighten the darkening season, you're carrying on an age-old tradition that bridges cultures around the world and reaffirms our connection to our departed loved ones. From the SiberianTimes.com, an article by Anna Lysowska. Is this the world's oldest secret code? The idol is the oldest wooden statue in the world, estimated as being constructed approximately 9,500 years ago, and preserved as if in a time capsule in a peat bog on the western fringe of Siberia. Expert Svetlana Savchenko, chief keeper of the sugar idol, believes that the structure's faces carry encoded information from ancient man in the Mesolithic era of the Stone Age concerning their understanding of the creation of the world. German scientists are now close to a precise dating, within 5 decades, of the remarkable artefact, which is a stunning example of ancient man's creativity. The results are likely to be known in late February or early March, the Siberian Times can reveal. Now the question is turning among academics to a better understanding of the symbols and pictograms on this majestic larch idol, one of Russia's greatest treasures. which is now on display in a special glass sarcophagus at its permanent home in the Ekaterinburg History Museum, where Savchenko is senior researcher. German prehistorian Professor Thomas Terberger said, "There is no such ancient sculpture in the whole of Europe. Studying this idol is a dream come true. We are expecting the first results of the test at the end of winter, early next year." Professor Mikhail Zeiland, leading researcher of the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Archaeology, explained, "We study the idol with a feeling of awe. This is a masterpiece, carrying gigantic emotional value and force. It is a unique sculpture. There is nothing else in the world like this. It is very alive and very complicated at the same time. The ornament is covered with nothing but encrypted information. People were passing on knowledge with the help of the idol. He is adamant that we can draw conclusions about the sophistication of the people who created this masterpiece, probably scraping the larch with a stone spoon, even though the detail of the code remains an utter mystery to modern man." Asked if they lived in permanent fear of the mighty forces of mysterious nature, nervously casting around, petrified by danger, he replied, "Forget it. The men or man who created this idol lived in total harmony with the world, had advanced intellectual development, and a complicated spiritual world. It is obvious that the elements of geometrical ornament had some meaning," stated Savchenko and Zeiland in explaining the idol's ancient markings. The difficulty of interpretation is the polysemy symbolism of these symbols. In other words, the possible multiple related meanings. According to ethnography, a straight line could denote land or horizon, the boundary between earth and sky, water and sky, or the borderline between the worlds. A wavy line or zigzag symbolized the watery element, snake, lizard, or determined a certain border. In addition, the zigzag signalled danger, like a pike. Cross, rhombus, square, circle depicted the fire or the sun, and so on. Savchenko and the other museum staff have postulated that among its purposes was that of an early map or navigator. Straight lines, wavy lines and arrows indicated ways of getting to the destination and the number of days for a journey, with waves meaning waterpath, straight lines meaning ravines, and arrows meaning hills, according to this theory, which has yet to be fully researched. Author Petra Zolan, citing scientific work by Savchenko and Zeiland, stated, "The characters of the idol cannot have an unambiguous interpretation. If these are images of spirits that inhabited the human world in ancient times, the vertical position of figures, one above the other, probably relate to their hierarchy. Placing images on the front and back planes of the idol possibly indicate that they belong to different worlds. If they are depicted myths about the origins of humans and the world, the vertical arrangement of the images may reflect the sequence of events. Ornaments can be special signs which mark something as significant. The idol reflects what these people looked like, with straight noses and high cheekbones. The impression of the main three-dimensional face with its gaping mouth is of an Aztec look, but it is only because the part of the nose of the main face was broken. In all there are 7 faces, 6 of which are one-dimensional. It is clear that the faces together with the ornament form separate figures," said Savchenko and Zeiland. "On both the front and back of the idol there are 3 figures. Here they are located one above the other, and the upper 7th figure connects both sides and crowns the composition. Some have claimed the idol includes primitive writing, which, if true, would be amongst the first on Earth. But there is no consensus among experts who have studied the Ural statue. The idol was preserved due to a stroke of luck concerning its resting place in the Urals. It happened thanks to a combination of antiseptics," said Professor Zeiland. "The idol was made from the phytoncidic larch, then canned in turf, which is an acid anaerobic environment that kills microorganism destroyers and also has a tanning effect. The scientists from the Lower Saxony State Office for Cultural Heritage are using accelerated mass spectrometry, enabling them to compare analysis of 5 microscopic samples of the larch from the idol with climate change data for the past 10,000 years. This will allow them to figure out when the exactly 159-year-old larch from which the idol is carved grew. The tests follow what Professor Terberger called a very successful summer trip in which we worked together with our Russian colleagues. The idol was originally recovered in 1890 near Kirovograd, some 2.8 metres in height. It appears to have 7 faces. It was protected down the millennia by a 4-metre layer of peat bog on the site of an open-air goldfield. Lack of funding has till now prevented the proper age testing of this Urals treasure. Professor Uwe Heusner from the Berlin Archaeological Institute said, "The idol is carved from larch, which, as we see by the annual rings, was at least 159 years old. The samples we selected contain important information about the isotopes that correspond to the time when the tree grew. The samples we used for testing were cut in 1997. The idol was extracted in several parts from the peat bog." Professor Dmitry I. Lobanov combined the main fragments to reconstitute the sculpture, 2.8 metres high, but in 1914 the Siberian archaeologist Vladimir Tolmachev proposed a variant of this reconstruction by integrating previously unused fragments. Typically, some of these fragments were later lost, so only Tolmachev's drawings of them remain. However, these suggest the original height of the statue was 5.3 metres. Some 1.93 metres of the statue did not survive the 20th century's revolutions and wars and is only visible on his drawings. But even the size it is now makes it the highest wooden statue in the world. One intriguing question debated by Russian scientists is how the idol, as tall as a 2-storey house, was kept in a vertical position. Museum staff believe it was never dug into the ground to help it stand upright, and that it was unlikely it was perched against a tree because it would have covered more than half of the ornaments. And if you'd like to know a bit more, visit the show notes, which is the episode 99 of the Mysteries Abound podcast at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. The website has some drawings and very clear photographs of the idol. They certainly make for an interesting look. Is Halloween just a delightful holiday for dressing up, parties and candy? Or is it really a time when restless spirits are allowed to roam more freely among the living? Is the veil that separates our world from the world of the dead more transparent at this time of the year? People report paranormal phenomena at all times of the year, of course. But there's something about Halloween night that heightens the senses and perhaps connects us more readily to forces unexplained. Consider these 6 chilling true stories of Halloween frights. From the paranormal.about.com website, by Stephen Wagner. Evil in the attic. Attics can be scary places, maybe even more so around Halloween time. Take it from Eve, who as a young girl ventured into her attic alone in search of costumes. "My mum and sister went to my neighbour's house, leaving me alone in the house," said Eve. "It was about 4:30 and already beginning to get dark. I took that opportunity to sneak upstairs into the attic to try on some Halloween stuff. I quickly ran up the stairs, knowing that if my mum came back and caught me, I would be in deep trouble. Although all the windows were shut, I felt a cold breeze pass through me. But I thought nothing of it at first because I had no past experiences of paranormal phenomena." Eve rummaged through the bag of Halloween costumes and pulled out a witch's hat, which she tried on for size. Almost immediately, some unseen force hit the hat. She dropped the bag and quickly turned around, but found nothing against which she could have knocked the hat. As I bent down to pick up the bag, I saw the handle to the bathroom door turn, and the door rapidly opened, Eve says. I walked cautiously into the bathroom, wondering what had caused the door to open in such a way. I had a feeling that there was another presence in the room. I looked out of the window to check if my mother and sister were still outside, and sure enough, they were. Just as I was about to turn away from the window, I saw the reflection of the cupboard door sliding open. I turned around hastily to try and see what was causing these incidents, but I wasn't quick enough to catch whatever it was. Terrified, Eve threw the bag back into the cupboard box and ran downstairs and out into the front garden, waiting anxiously for her mum to return home. That night I had a nightmare about what might have followed if I'd stayed up there any longer, Eve says. Evil, gleaming red eyes stared at me from the bathroom cupboard, locking me in the toilet and causing complete havoc all around the house. Several unexplainable things have happened up there since then, including self-breaking objects. What was it, beside her own equilibrium, that Eve disturbed in that attic that evening? The Phantom's car. It was Halloween evening 1995, when Pamela and her brother were heading home on a country road near Greenbelt, Maryland. As it was darkening, Pamela reckons that they were moving at about 25 to 30 miles per hour on the two-lane road with her brother at the wheel. Suddenly appearing behind them and approaching quickly was a black vehicle with two large round and glaringly bright headlights. Almost as quickly, the car was beside them on the left as if trying to pass. But Pamela says it seemed that the old black car was floating rather than riding the pavement. This old car was in the path of head-on traffic, Pamela recalls. It seems like those other cars kept going without interruption. My brother and I looked over inside the car and there were 4 young teenagers, 2 men and 2 young ladies. Strangely, they looked to be dressed in farm clothing from the 1930s or 1940s, and they all looked as white as ghosts. The young lady in the front passenger seat turned her head slowly to Pamela and her brother and smiled, then turned back. The 2 people in the back seat just stared. Then inexplicably the car floated past them and vanished into thin air. But that's not the end of this ghost story. In 1997, my brother and I were on the same road around the same time, again coming home, Pamela says. And the same spirits appeared and repeated the same scene. In 1998, my brother was alone driving home on this road, and the same ghosts appeared again, repeating the same scenario. Maybe these teens were going out on Halloween and got into some terrible accident. They are clearly stuck on this road driving. God rest their souls. The Voice in Blood Cemetery. At Halloween, many people test their bravery by venturing into dark cemeteries. Sarah and her husband, who had always been fascinated by the unknown, decided to do just that on Halloween night of 2002. It was an experience, she says, that changed her life. We chose Blood Cemetery in Mukwonago, Wisconsin, Sarah tells us. I think it goes by a different name now, but the Blood family was the first African-American family in that town, and they are buried in that cemetery near a statue of a book on a pillar. Sarah's husband used to live in that town and often heard tales of supernatural events occurring in the cemetery. This got Sarah's juices flowing. So armed with a camera, 2 flashlights and an audio recording device, they headed into the tiny cemetery. We headed for the Blood Monument first, she says. After waiting around in vain for the Blood family to show themselves, we did a little walking around. We were about 48 feet away from the Blood Monument when something made us turn around and look back. I saw what appeared to be a giant blue orb. It was about the size and shape of a human head and about that far off the ground. I didn't look long enough to make out a face, so I cannot tell you if it truly was a face or not. That's all it took for Sarah and her husband to run out of the cemetery at a speed they never imagined they could attain. Although the ground was dry, they both stumbled and tripped as they ran. Her husband said he felt as though he was being sucked into the ground, but Sarah swore it felt more like hands grabbing at her ankles and pants. At the outer edge of the cemetery, they caught their breath and gathered their courage for one more short walk around the gravestones with the audio recorder and camera. I tried to open myself up a little, and I was lured to a random area of the cemetery, says Sarah. We stood there for about 10 seconds until I felt the sudden urge to run. I said, "Oh my God, we've got to go." I started running with all my might. My husband followed. I turned and I snapped a picture of the spot where we were standing. When we got back to the car, we listened to the audio. This is what we heard. The shuffling of our feet in the leaves, and then it stops. "Grr, get out." The voice was obviously not human, but not quite animal, Sarah is certain. It was a demon. The picture showed a whole lot of nothing, except for two little red eyes. The hooded figure. High schoolers and even college students seem to love Halloween as much as little kids do. It's an opportunity to challenge their fears of the unknown and to indulge in scary pranks. Chris will never forget the Halloween of 1981 when he was enrolled at a college in his hometown. Chris and 5 or 6 of his friends decided to check out a small cemetery at the edge of campus. A rusty, worn chain-link fence encircled the few graves of past college faculty and their relatives. It wasn't long before I felt something, Chris remembers. A few minutes later, I heard the crunch and rhythm of footsteps shuffling through the leaves on the ground. Some of the others heard it too, and we all looked in the direction of the footsteps, and when we didn't see anyone, we assumed it was another friend trying to scare us. They all laughed it off at first, but the sound of the footsteps continued. Every couple of minutes, Chris would look down the length of the fence. He squinted his eyes, trying to find the prankster in the dark, but he couldn't see anyone, even as the crunch of leaves got louder and closer. Then to the left of his vision, coming from the dark edge of the woods, Chris saw it. Vague in shape, it was definitely cloaked in black, head to foot, Chris says. It seemed to move in spurts of speed, and then as though time fast-forwarded, it would be ahead of my speed of sight, closer to me than before, until it stopped at the corner post of the fence. The figure changed shape from a thin, tall form as it turned to its left and faced the students. It was cloaked and hooded, although Chris could make out no arms nor eyes to look at for familiarity. There was no shape of feet, even though the hem of its cloak floated inches above the leaves and grass. Scared, Chris wheeled away from the whole affair and, without saying a word to his friends, ran uphill to the first lighted building he could find. "I felt someone running beside me," he says. "I was relieved when I saw one of my friends. We stopped running and asked each other what we saw, and we both said the same words, saw the same vision. Since that night I have seen my friend often, except for one occasion a couple of years after that Halloween. We have never talked about what we saw that night." Ouija attack dogs. Halloween often inspires people to break out their Ouija boards, even if the talking board has been sitting gathering dust on a shelf for the rest of the year. Bea and her friends Ingrid, Anna, Lara and May decided to experiment with the board one Halloween night some years ago in Bea's house in Australia. Bea's parents were away on business, and her brother and sister were visiting an uncle in South Australia, so she and her friends had the house to themselves for a sleepover. Naturally, sleep was the last thing on their minds. Anna, who was really into seances and the paranormal, suggested playing with the board, which she brought with her. "I have 2 Pomeranian dogs, Muffy, Tan and Shadow, black," says Bea, "and my friend Ingrid has a white Pomeranian called Hayley." Muffy, Shadow and Hayley, along with Anna's dog Ernie and Lara's 2 dogs, Archie and Rosie, were all in the backyard, and we hadn't heard a peep out of them for about an hour. Upstairs in Bea's bedroom, the girls arranged themselves in a circle with Anna's Ouija board in the centre. They each placed 2 fingers on the planchette. Anna started by asking the board, "Is there anybody there?" The board moved to yes. Then Ingrid asked, "Who?" and the board spelled out, "Gail." "Who are you?" another girl asked. Again the board spelled out only, "Gail." More detail another requested, but the board only spelled, "Gail." "What's going to happen tonight?" Bea asked. "Dogs," the board spelled. "What are you going to do to our dogs?" "You'll see," replied the Ouija. Bea pushed the board aside and the girls just sat there staring at each other. The silence was soon broken by a piercing whimper from the backyard. The 5 girls jumped up and raced downstairs, fearing for their dogs. We flung the back door open and raced out, says B. We soon discovered Lara's dog Archie whimpering in a corner. We didn't even take a second glance at any of them. We simply picked up our dogs, all of them were small ones, and ran them inside up to my room. Once we had them upstairs, we fussed around inspecting every inch of them. Lara screamed, and we rushed over to see her holding Archie, who had a burn mark on his left side in the shape of a pentagram in a circle, the symbol for witchcraft. We spent the whole night with the dogs in our arms and vowed to burn the board the next morning. Suicide ghost. This experience is very dear to me, though it grows blurry with time, Satori tells us. Memories fade like breath upon a mirror, especially ones that were dim to begin with. But this is what I remember. I do not know exactly what I saw, but I do know it changed me. Satori's experience took place at an all-girls Catholic college she attended, where it was rumoured that a particular bathroom was haunted. The girls frequently talked about the icy air in this room, and of hearing and seeing strange things, and a feeling of being watched. Satori dismissed them all as tall tales. One Halloween, however, Satori and her friend decided to go and talk to this spirit. They went into one of the bathroom stalls that had a bathtub, because it was said to be the centre of the haunting energy. My friend got into the tub and started feeling around, Satori says. I did too, and I felt the most amazing feeling. A tingling like electric current coming from the walls and faucets. I was stunned, but oddly enough, not afraid. Elated was more the word. We got out of the tub and that's when I saw it, the pale image of a young girl with dark hair and deep, sad eyes. She was wearing some kind of slip. Her wrists were cut and her blood was dripping down the drain. She looked like me. Again, I did not feel fear, only sympathy. I think she put the razor in the soap dish, I said to my friend. I know, she answered. Suddenly I felt this presence, this tingling warm feeling inside me, like the way your arms prickle before a storm. I said to it, come out, do not be afraid. And the feeling got stronger. Then I said, it's okay, we understand, you can go back. And the feeling seemed to move upward in my body until it disappeared. Then there was no more energy. When the girls stood to leave, however, Satori was stricken with an overwhelming feeling of sadness and loneliness. I knew she did not want us to leave, Satori said. I said to her gently, I'm so sorry, but we can't help you. You need to go back now. Then I felt the sadness lift and the room grew lighter. I felt her leave. She never returned and no one spoke of her again. But I will never forget her. She taught me a lesson. Compassion heals all wounds, whether alive or dead. And from the creepypasta.com website, a story by Liam Vickers, The Pursuit Institute. 2 years ago, a bunch of friends and I went on a school-sponsored trip to Alaska set up by the Pursuit Institute. I was placed in a group with 10 other students and 2 adult chaperones. Another group was also made up of similar numbers, and each group would start at one location, and then we would switch places halfway through. The trip would consist mostly of hiking and backpacking in Denali, where we would camp in tents, and then hiking near the Kenai Peninsula, where we would stay in a cabin. We arrived in Anchorage at about 2 in the morning, but it was still light out, as Alaska never really got dark that time of year. Our group parted ways after claiming our baggage, and my group began our trip by driving to Denali National Park, where we would be spending the next several days. We all had a great time, and before we knew it, it was time to meet up with the other group and trade places for the second half of our trip. We converged in front of a supermarket, and the 2 groups swapped stories and shared some laughs. It was all fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the other group. Their stories would be incredibly vague, or they would just stop halfway through as if they caught themselves from mentioning something without even realising it. It was all incredibly eerie, but no one but me seemed to notice. When I tried to question them further or go into detail about their trip, they would simply become dazed and say that it was all really just a blur. Then, getting defensive, they would ask me details about our trip so far. I scoffed and tried to remember a specific event, only to find that I really didn't remember much either. In fact, as I began listening to my group's own stories, we were being just as vague as them. It was all so strange that no one, not even I, immediately noticed that the other group was short one kid. Suddenly, though, it hit me. "Where's Josh?" I asked the group. Everyone turned to face me. Their eyes seemed glazed and cloudy as their faces reflected my own confusion right back at me. What they said next made my blood run cold. With such genuine seriousness that it couldn't have possibly been a joke, one by one they asked, "Who the hell is Josh?" Even the adults looked puzzled. Giving a nervous laugh, I turned to my own group for support, only to see that they were looking at me with the same expressions. Confusion was plastered across every one of their faces, looking at me with blank eyes. Then suddenly confusion turned to laughter, as if they realised that I had been joking. "Ha! Nice man, you had me going for a second there," Matt said as the mood quickly lightened back up. I laughed with them and pretended that it had been a joke, but all I felt was a horrible sickness rushing up inside me. That's when a kid from the other group said, "Ha! But seriously, what's with your group? You guys are all acting weird and... Where is Sarah?" "Ha! Very funny." "Yeah, real original." Members of both groups snapped back at him, almost in unison. No one named Sarah had even been in our group, and even I was pissed that he was making fun of me. That is, until I saw the look on his face. When no one took him seriously, his appearance was bleached to a deathly pale tone, and his eyes widened, shifting from side to side nervously. Then he looked at me. Our eyes met, and we both knew that something was horribly wrong. Although we couldn't really be sure that the other was telling the truth, we both seemingly knew someone who was now forgotten. We simply stood there for what felt like forever, staring at each other. He looked horrified. I'm sure I did too. Before I got a chance to talk to him, however, we were shoved into our separate cars and we were on our way to our new destinations. Their group to Denali, ours to the cabin. I doubted talking to him would have done any good anyway, though. What could either of us have said? He didn't remember Josh, and I sure as hell didn't know anyone named Sarah. The more I thought about it, the more I began to convince myself that it must have been a joke by everyone to screw with me. A group joke that everyone was in on except for me. Josh was probably just hiding in the car, laughing his ass off. I felt like such an idiot for believing that another kid had experienced what I had, when he was really just flat out mocking me in front of everyone. I buried my face in my hands. Part of me was angry, but I was mostly relieved. It certainly made more sense to think that it was all just a joke on me. I was actually impressed that they'd got the adults in on it too. But overall I was still pretty pissed, and I decided that the next time I saw the kid who mocked me, I would punch him straight in the face. How dare he mess with me by making up someone? Sarah Duffy, yeah right. My mind froze. Duffy? He had never said a last name. Where did I get that from? And why did it sound so familiar? What startled me was that I even had a face to put with the name. My mind suddenly exploded with pictures and memories. Sarah! She was my best goddamn friend. How the hell did I forget about her? I was clutching my head and gasping for air as everyone in the car looked at me and began yelling for me to calm the hell down. I couldn't calm down, though. My mind felt like it was being smashed with a sledgehammer, and the more my memory cleared, the worse it got. Pain, the likes of which I had never experienced before, racked my body as I curled into a ball, shivering and straining to maintain consciousness. The memories continued rushing back into my head, threatening to split my mind into two, until suddenly it was over. I sat up and bleary-eyed looked around me. Everyone stared right back at me, terrified. Guys, Sarah Duffy, please, dear God, tell me you remember her. I practically screamed. Their faces once again switched to anger. God damn it, John, one of the adult chaperones yelled. We thought you were having a seizure or something. If you pull one more stunt like that for the sake of a joke, we'll send you straight home. Are you okay? What the hell was that? I began tearing up. You guys don't know Sarah. She was my friend. She was your friend, for Christ's sake. I began searching for a specific memory. Kevin, you made fun of her goofy hair right when we got off the plane in Anchorage, I cried. Please, for the love of God, tell me you remember that. No one said a thing. They all just stared at me with judgmental expressions. That joke has run its course, Kevin said coldly. Not a one of them showed any sign of recognition, but I knew she was real, or had been anyway. What the hell had happened to her? I strained and tried to remember the last time I'd seen her, but any recent memories were still elusive and blurry. No matter how hard I tried, all thinking about it did was bring back the headaches and pain. Finally, I was forced to stop, or everyone would begin to seriously worry about me again. I just sat in the car for the next several hours of the drive and stared out the window at the bleak grey surroundings as rain ran down the glass. It had been raining since we arrived in Alaska, and it showed no signs of letting up for the next couple of days at least. Finally, we arrived at the entrance to the trail that would take us to the cabin the other group had stayed at. We unloaded our packs, strapped them on and set out on our 7-mile hike to where the secluded lakeside cabin lay. It was about 2 in the morning, but since it never really got dark out, our plan was to hike in immediately and get there by 5, so as to have a full day ahead of us. That being said, however, the constant rain and low clouds made for poor visibility, and the hike in was a struggle to say the least. Through the thick fog, it was near impossible to even make out a tree branch before it struck you in the face, seemingly out of nowhere. Being mindful of possible grizzly bears, we took care to keep our group loud so as to scare them off. About an hour in, we were all singing Journey at the top of our lungs when I suddenly fell to my knees, then collapsed to the muddy ground, clutching my head. I had once again been trying to remember when I had last seen Sarah, when it all came flooding back in an horrific wave of grotesque images and unimaginable terrors. There we were at the Denali campground. The torrential rain pelted down and the sky was so dark that for the first time since we had been there, it actually seemed like night. Everyone was settling down under the tarp around the campfire, and many people were already asleep in their tents. That's when Jenna asked if anyone had seen Sarah, as she still hadn't washed her dishes. I was pretty sure she went to bed already, I said. I don't want to be creepy, but I'll go and check to be sure. I reluctantly walked away from the warmth of the fire and into the oppressive darkness and driving cold rain. As I approached her tent, I could tell that she wasn't inside, as it was unzipped with the door lying wide open. I immediately ran to close it. What an idiot, I thought to myself. The tent is completely soaked inside now. That's when I heard her muffled, agonizing scream. It came from somewhere in the woods surrounding the campground, and I, without thinking, immediately ran off into the forest after her. After shoving my way through some thick spruce and willows, I reached a clearing where I could barely see Sarah's body on the ground, as some thing, which was mostly obscured by trees and underbrush, was ripping her open. She was screaming with all of her might, but the thing's bony, hooked hand was covering her mouth. Its long fingers curled almost all the way around her head. The sound of her death was horrendous, as bones snapped and skin was peeled away. I wanted to help, but couldn't bring myself to move. Sarah was long dead by the time I realised that the creature was beginning to wear her. It had hollowed her out and was now sewing her lifeless corpse onto itself. I was still paralysed with fear when it suddenly turned towards me. Sarah's grotesque, shredded carcass was now horribly reanimated, and it began crawling towards me like some kind of broken marionette as her dead eyes looked straight ahead, yet saw nothing. I finally broke out of my trance and began frantically sprinting back towards camp. Sarah's corpse could have easily caught me crawling, but the thick underbrush forced it to stand up awkwardly and begin a demented walk in which everything moved all wrong. This fortunately gave me enough time to reach the safety of the campfire, although when I arrived I had no idea what I had been running from, or really any of what I had just done. No one asked me if Sarah had really been asleep, because none of us knew a Sarah. And that thing pretending to be her, cringing at the light of the fire, slowly slunk back into the dark of the forest. I bolted upright to people yelling, cursing and struggling to their feet. I had been near the front of the group, so when I fell to the ground, many people behind me tripped over my body and then tripped the people behind them. "Oh God, I'm sorry you guys," I cried. The ground is really slick here." Grumbles were heard and several insults flew my way, but we all eventually got up and continued moving. My mind was racing. The fact that I could remember Sarah when no one else could must have had something to go with seeing the creature before it stole her skin. For me, it must have just been the initial shock that caused the lapse in memory. It was for this same reason that I could remember Josh while the other kid didn't. My blood froze. He didn't remember Josh because his memory had blocked the horror from him, because he had seen Josh being taken in the exact same area in which we were now hiking, and our bear calls were bringing it right to us. Breathing heavily, I slowly turned my head around to look behind me. Sure enough, following from quite a distance, and just barely visible in the bleak grey fog, I could see the silhouette of some sort of fucked up human impersonation, grotesquely stumbling along just behind our group, wearing the decaying face of Josh. Its limbs swayed and bent in directions impossible for a human to imitate, and there were seams where the skin split away and was held together with nothing but a few fleshy strands. When the creature saw me looking, it darted away off the path, but I could tell that it was still following us. It was waiting for something. I doubted it would attack us with such a large group, and I was sure that no one would believe me, and so I was forced to simply continue hiking. Finally we reached the cabin, and everyone tried to get some last-minute sleep before we started our day. Everyone but me. I knew that thing was skulking around in the darkness of the woods, surrounding the cabin, waiting for one of us to go out alone. Morning came and everyone quickly prepared for our hike of the day. We would be hiking up a mountain, which required some intense bushwhacking just to reach the base, thus realistically making the trip at least 4 hours both ways. We packed our lunches, consisting of nothing but protein bars and water, and zipped up our rain gear, as the weather was still nothing short of a downpour. The sky remained a depressing grey, and light thunder could be heard rumbling in the distance. That's when someone said what I had been dreading, the worst-case scenario. Ashley stepped forward and apologetically said, "Sorry everyone, but I feel just terrible. I think I'll stay behind on this one. You guys go on ahead. I'll stay here at the cabin." "No," I cried. "You have to come with us. We have to stay together." Everyone turned and looked at me. "Jesus, John, if she's not feeling well, let her stay," Pam scorned. I stammered, "That's not it. Fine, I'll stay too." "You don't have to do that, John," Ashley said. "I'll be fine here alone." "No, you won't." I wanted to scream, but I had to calm my nerves. "No, I didn't want to go on this dumb hike anyway," I laughed. "You guys have fun, though." Everyone looked at me weirdly and then glanced at each other, before shrugging and heading off into the woods. I wasn't sure if we would be any safer with just the two of us, but what else could I have done? We would just have to buckle down inside the cabin and hope for the best. As soon as the others disappeared out of sight, I turned to Ashley and said, "All right, we need to get inside the cabin now." "I appreciate you staying with me and all, but you're kind of freaking me out," she said. Sorry," I awkwardly laughed. "It's pretty damn wet out here, though. We really should be inside." "Yeah, that's a good plan," she stated slowly. "I better lay down for a bit." That's when I saw him, or it, standing 20 or so feet behind Ashley. Josh's decaying corpse, horribly stretched and disfigured in order to cover whatever the thing was wearing. Ashley saw me looking and turned around to let out a strangled squeak. What the fuck is that?" she screamed. I said nothing and simply grabbed her arm, taking off, running to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. The thing didn't run after us. Rather, it began slowly walking towards the cabin. It knew we had nowhere to go. I locked the door and scrambled to barricade it with anything I could find. Now there was nothing to do but watch its demented impression of a person as it crawled ever so slowly towards the door. Its hands dragged along the muddy ground, and its fleshy skin hide swayed ever so softly as it staggered. "What the hell is that?" Ashley kept repeating over and over between her ragged breaths. "I don't know," I stammered. "I just don't know." "What does it want?" she screamed as it reached the door and tried the handle. "I assume it wants a new coat," I said through clenched teeth. She drew a breath and fell to the ground before looking up at me horrified. The thing moved away from the door and now stood a few inches behind one of the windows, staring in at us. Its cold gaze could be felt from behind the dead eyes of Josh's face, and we could hear skin widening as it smiled. It was messing with us. Ashley broke down and began weeping. "Leave us alone," she cried. "Get the hell away." The thing did nothing and simply stood there motionless. Then it slowly lifted up one of its hands and began lightly rapping on the window. Knock, 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 a slow, steady rhythm. It had no intention of breaking the window or anything. It just wanted to let us know that it was there. Not that we needed the reminder. I couldn't take my eyes off it. This continued for several hours as the sunlight slowly faded and the rain and wind picked up. Soon the sound of it knocking was almost drowned out, and I was having to strain to see it in the dim light. Heavy sheets of water whipped around and obscured its form. At one point I let my eyes wander for too long, and when I looked back, it was gone. The knocking had stopped. I bolted upright just in time to barely catch a glimpse of it disappearing around the side of the cabin. "This is bad," I said. "I think it's tired of waiting." Ashley let out a squeal and buried her face in her hands. I wasn't sure if it could get in from somewhere else, but it clearly knew something we didn't. "It's okay," I said, thinking fast, trying to pep-talk myself more than anything. "All we need to do is wait for the others to get back. They should be here any minute now." "Who?" Ashley asked. "The rest of our group," I said. "Kevin, Lauren, Pam, those guys, remember?" I don't know who you're talking about," she stated, looking at me puzzled. "It's always been just the two of us." My heart practically stopped as I sunk to the ground in despair. I began to hear knocks all around the cabin. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, www.origins.info. Our Facebook page is www.facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just click on the Facebook link from the show notes. Hasn't been any donations in the past few weeks, so I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who has made a donation in the past. Your ongoing support has been and is greatly appreciated. So until next time, everyone, this is Paul saying bye for now, and I'm just going to head off and think about what I'm going to do for episode 100 of the Mysteries Abound podcast. So bye for now, everyone, and keep well.